My name is Benny Raz. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing Eli and the films that we will be watching. I'll first tell you a little bit about him. Eli's journey towards filmmaking began quite early. He wrote and self-published his first novel at the age of 9. It's crazy, right? Yeah. And by the age of 14, he had written 4. It's crazy. In high school, he was the provincial and national debating and mock trial champion and an actor in a variety of plays and musicals. By the time he finished high school, he written and directed his debut short film, A Deaf Man's Symphony, which is what we will be watching today. This film, in addition to his academic achievements, earned him the University of Toronto's most prestigious undergraduate award and scholarship, the UofT National Scholarship, which brought him here for 4 years for a full ride. In his first year at UofT, he wrote a screenplay for a short film called I'm Still Here about mental health and drama therapy. However, 5 weeks before production, the dean's office at Victoria College shut the film down, beginning a year-long struggle where Eli and a number of his professors fought for the right to make the film. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. The film was eventually killed by COVID in March 2020. However, there was a silver lining here. This experience marked the beginning of Eli's emergence as a public speaker at UofT, particularly as a champion for free speech and free expression. He was invited by Professor A.F. Moritz to guest lecture at Victoria College about his experiences trying to make I'm Still Here, and was then invited to speak at a variety of panels and symposiums about activism, mental health, and the arts. In his second year, Eli was selected by Canon Canada as one of 20 emerging Canadian creators for the first ever 12-month creative incubator program, Canon Futures, where he received mentorship from some of Canada's top film industry professionals. Some great accomplishments. When he graduated earlier this summer, he received the 2023 Norman Jewison Fellowship in Film Studies from the Cinema Studies Institute. The Moriyama
I have no idea.
okay. Moriyama Gold Medal for Excellence in the Arts, and a Victoria College Postgraduate Scholarship for his academic excellence. This summer saw the premiere of The Only Bar on King Street, a proof of concept short film written and directed by Eli, which we will also be seeing today. Finally, as some of you know, Eli will be leaving us. He will be moving to Berlin to complete his master's in film directing and to continue pursuing his philosophical interest in the studies of consciousness, meditation, secular spirituality, and psychedelic-assisted therapy. So tonight, we will be screening 2 of his films, A Deaf Man's Symphony and The Only Bar on King Street. I'll then invite Eli up to the stage, and he will be giving a talk called How to See the Future. Later, we will have a little discussion and open up the floor for you guys all to speak as well. So without further ado, we will enjoy both A Deaf Man's Symphony and The Only Bar on King Street. Congrats on those 2, man. Without further ado, I'm going to welcome Eli.
Aw, you guys are a lovely bunch. My first line is supposed to be hi everybody, but I feel like we're just at a dinner table. I can hang out with you guys. First of all, I want to thank Ben for a really kind introduction. Ben's a pretty extraordinary guy and an extraordinary musician. I had the pleasure of meeting him this summer and working with him on his upcoming EP, the Masquerade EP, which is one of the most incredible collections of songs that I have heard. And I had the opportunity to be there while he was recording. It was amazing, him working his magic. And Ben also did a philosophy specialist degree at U of T. So you would struggle to find someone better read than him. And I have to insist that you go up to him after and pick his brain and talk with him about ideas and his work. And we'll be chatting right after the Q&A. Thank you, man. So as Ben said in his introduction, I am counting down the days before I move to Berlin, which makes me all the more grateful to be here with you. But I was only given about a week's notice about this, and I actually considered turning it down, partly because I didn't know if I'd have time to prepare something that was worthy of your time and your attention, which I take very seriously. And I ended up making that time, and you won't get anything half-baked, I promise, but I was really worried about you, and I was worried about audience, because I wasn't sure how many people would come on such short notice. And in fact, I had someone the other day make the very ordinary and encouraging remark, I hope a lot of people show up. And it hit me like a truck, because I'd been thinking about the same thing. And because you've just seen these films, you might understand the irony here. All of my work is about audience, about performance. I'm fascinated and obsessed with this. And I think that in some way we all are. So I'm gonna talk about performance for a little bit. And then I'll get into the meat of my talk, which will be about 35, 40 minutes. And the plan is to get you out of here by 9 p.m. Cool? All right. We should get audience participation. Everyone on board? Oh, look at you guys. Okay, so the way that I feel is that most people, when they confront something deeply personal in their lives, are fairly tempted, and rightly so, to keep it to themselves. Maybe you share it with friends or a partner or therapist. My impulse, when something deeply personal happens in my life, is to tell a story about it to a room full of strangers. And some of you will probably share this feeling. It's an odd problem, and it's not exactly a problem of oversharing, not as I see it. I'm a filmmaker. I professionalize in emotional distortion. And I have fairly healthy boundaries when it comes to respecting my private life. But I'm also a philosopher, which means I professionalize in intellectualizing, which I will warn you there will be a fair bit of today. It's slightly unavoidable when you have to give a talk at UofT. But there's two reasons that I can think of that might explain this obsession that I have. The first is that when I was really young, I would act as if I was in a TV show. Kind of like the Truman Show. I would be walking down the street, or I would be sitting in my room alone, and I would be behaving as if I were being watched. Sometimes by friends or by family, or I'd imagine a crush. And I ran this little mental drill so much that I think it became quite deeply ingrained in me. Because in my head, it was a positive exercise, right? I mean, if you are always thinking about the way that you are being perceived, even if you are in fact alone, you sit up straighter, right? You walk a little bit cooler, you're a little bit more suave. And it felt like there were only benefits to be had by adopting this voyeuristic outlook on myself. That's maybe not the case, I've discovered. But I think it in part explains why my interests gravitated this way, why they gravitated towards performance, and it's possible that it's what set me up for debate and for public speaking and for theater, so I am thankful for it. But the second reason is a particular event in my life, and it's one that Ben alluded to. He mentioned my books. I published, when I published my third one, I was living in Singapore. I was 12 years old, and my teacher found out about it. And he came up to me one day and he said, "Eli, do you know what a book launch is?" I said, "No, I have no idea." And he said, "It's like a party for when someone writes a book. We want to throw one for you." I said, "Awesome." And it's worth mentioning that Singapore is a country that holds education as one of its highest values. I mean, they take education more seriously than almost any other place on the planet. They act kind of like gangsters. So my dad's a professor, and he's given me the scoop. So the universities will hunt for the smartest professors across the world, and they will sit them down, and they will simply make them an offer that they can't refuse. Like this is how they work. And this reveals an extremely precise use of resources, right? It makes a clear statement, one that I think is best put by Sir Ken Robinson, who said in his now famous TED Talk, It's education that is meant to take us into this future we can't grasp, which is something I profoundly believe. So this was case in point, right? The second that they saw a student writing a book, they recognized the immense value in pouring a good deal of time, resources, and money into publicly celebrating this achievement. And not only because it looks good for the school, but I think genuinely because they wanted to inspire fellow students, and I think genuinely wanted to celebrate what I'd done as well. And so I do believe that they only had good intentions. But a few weeks later, my school was plastered with posters for this upcoming gala book launch, which was very exciting. And I remember a student approaching me one day in the library, and he said, "Are you the guy who's written the book?" And we had a brief exchange, and partway through he said, "Is that your author voice?" And I panicked and I said, "No." But he'd absolutely called my bluff. And I returned my voice to its normal 12-year-old pitch. But the seeds of performing in everyday life were starting to grow. And then the book launch happened. And they went all out. They printed 100 copies of my book and they stacked it in a pyramid. They blew up a poster twice the size of me of the front cover. Before it all started, they had me sit down before a set of blinding lights and very intimidating cameras. I was expecting you to be taking a photo of me. Very intimidating cameras for an interview by a small film crew, which was my school's promotional team, who had been following me for the entire week to every one of my classes, filming B-roll of my interactions with teachers and friends. And I journaled about this, and I'll read you a passage, just really for the last line here. I wrote, 80 people showed up to the event. I only knew about half of them. Refreshments and snacks were offered. They offered people wine. Mr. Westall gave a speech, and the head of school, too. I gave a reading of a couple pages. I signed copies, shook hands, took photos, answered questions, absorbed compliments. It was an extraordinary moment. I felt like a superstar. My blazer was too big for me. So I cannot express to you how grateful I am for that opportunity. And I don't mean to put it down, and I don't mean to sound above it or ungrateful. How much confidence it gave me as a young artist at that age to be celebrated in that way with that level of support. But the thing is that these books, much like the games that I would play as a kid with my brother and with my best friend, where we would create characters and we would improvise these elaborate multi-day storylines. These books were only ever meant for our own enjoyment, right? Like these books were written for my family and my friends and for myself. And so not only do I think I became addicted to the high of accomplishment and recognition, but my perception of audience was turned on its head. It completely subverted my understanding of who I was creating for, and therefore why I was creating. So that may have seemed like a bit of an aside, but it was very relevant to what I want to speak about today. And as you can tell, I'm going to try and keep this a bit more conversational, and I'm going to let us wander through a variety of places because I'd like to try out some new ideas tonight. And some of them are quite bold. In fact, I have a point to make that I'm very excited about, but I'm also quite nervous about, and I think you'll see why. But I have thought very carefully about everything I'm going to say to you, and I genuinely believe it. I don't believe it in a religious or spiritual sense. I really hate the word spiritual. And if you know me, you know that I'm very much not religious, although I'm very interested in religion. And as it happens, if any of you here are religious, particularly if you practice prayer, you will actually be a couple steps ahead of me. But my deep love is for thinking, for clear, rational, empirical thinking. I love science, and I'm a philosopher, surprise, surprise. I tend to think my way to my beliefs rather than to feel them. And you're probably thinking, what on earth is he going to say? I have a bit of a flair for the dramatic. I like to keep people in suspense. What I ask is if I say anything tonight that you don't understand, or better, that you disagree with, or better yet, that you have something to say about, make a mental note or a physical note, and tell me in the Q&A. Because, again, we're like a little family here. Like, we'll get into it. We'll have a discussion. This is really important to me. And the whole point of a university space is to share ideas and figure things out. So let's get into it. I'm going to take off by talking about a very specific fear that I have. And it's a fear that's been growing in me for a long time. And I want to explore it. It's a fear that I can see the future in a very specific way. Question for you. How many of you have seen Oppenheimer? You? In the booth? Oh, let's go. I love Oppenheimer. I've seen it 3 times. The second time I saw it with Aaron, I was struck by the thought that this is really a movie about a man who sees the future. A man who knows the consequences of his actions, but feels that he has no choice but to proceed. And I related to this quite a bit. I'm not planning on blowing up Japan, but I am interested in the idea that there are times in, yes, right? There are times in life where we feel as if we can see what's ahead of us. And what's ahead scares us. Yet we feel helplessly compelled to move toward it anyway. So here's what I mean. There's a pattern in my life. And let's call it the pattern. With every film that I've written, I have found myself personally living out its themes during the course of making it. Every time. And sometimes it's more direct than others, but this happens every time. So 3 films and 3 examples. A Deaf Man's Symphony, the first film we watched. This is a film about performance and about audience. And to me, it was specifically about examining why I have this impulse to perform. So writing it, the question was, what would it take for a performer who loves and perhaps needs his audience, who starts with the full house and all the attention in the world, what would it take for them to decide to block out their audience? To literally block out the applause, and to be happy with that choice. And I was trying to convince myself of something that I didn't believe when I was writing it. Which is that you don't need recognition for your art to be meaningful. So here's how the pattern began. Writing novels is a very solitary thing. And even the first kind of home films that I made, I was a tyrant. I mean, this was not collaboration, this was a dictatorship. And over the course of making A Deaf Man's Symphony, I collaborated for the first time with Sheldon Graham, who's just amazing in both of those films, isn't he? And obviously we've now worked together several times, but really I was still finding my footing, and the crew was my parents and my brother, my girlfriend at the time, and my friends. And so my ex was the producer, and she became very involved, and I know that I couldn't have made it without her. And we went to a very small high school in Victoria. And so as buzz was growing around the film, people were starting to say things like, oh, you're part of Eli's film. And, oh, I'm going to see Eli's film tomorrow. And so while she understood, of course, that people were saying this is because I happen to be the director, and because in film, the director tends to be king, I think she was a little bit bothered by it, and I was too. And at the same time, I think my brother, who was working on the production with me, was starting to feel a little bit in my shadow. And so I was thinking about these things, and after the premiere, I vowed never to use a possessory credit again. So at the top of that poster, it says a film by Eli Meadow Ramraj. Possessory credit is that. It's a Steven Spielberg film, a Martin Scorsese picture, as opposed to a writer-director credit, which is what I don't even think it's on the King Street poster. Yes. There's directors, Steven Soderbergh rejects the possessory credit altogether. He uses pseudonyms so that his name appears fewer times in the credits. This is a subject of debate. But much like Sheldon's character in Deaf Man, I began to learn and to feel that it really didn't matter if my name was the one in the lights, or at least that I didn't need it. And to return to the theme of audience, we had this glamorous 2-night premiere with packed houses both nights. And so, ironically, if I was trying to prove to myself that I didn't need audience, I failed miserably, right? I mean, I was spoon-fed recognition. And so I didn't solve this problem, but it was undeniable that life was confronting me with the same questions that I was confronting in the film. And this very well could have been dismissed as a coincidence, but it happened again, and with more serious consequences, when I tried to make I'm Still Here. And so I'm Still Here was about confronting the past. It was specifically about trauma, and about how terrible things can find you in places where you ought to feel safe. And as Ben alluded to, I spent a year of my life fighting a losing battle, with the support of my professors, trying to convince Victoria College to let me make this thing. And so perhaps, the heartbreak of having an institution crush the project that you've been working on for a year doesn't quite constitute trauma, although if you're an artist, I'm sure you'd agree that, the stifling of the creative spirit, of passion, it's like a little death, I mean, it's like someone killing your baby. But then during the year I was fighting to make this film, I ended up involved in a violent altercation after a car crash, right on my doorstep. I was living at Victoria College, and this happened at Queen's Park. And as soon as the police left, I thought, no way, I'm living my screenplay. It was that moment. And then it happened again with King Street. So you've seen the first 16 minutes, right? Obviously, we have yet to make the feature, but as you can see, this is a film, again, about performance. And it's about the turmoil of having something to say, but not being given the opportunity to say it. In some ways, this was an expression of how I felt about I'm Still Here. And it's Jay begging Mark to take a chance on him, to give him a stage. We tried making this film as a feature. We miraculously secured $160,000, and when things fell apart a couple months before shooting, I had to call everyone on the team and tell them that although we now had very little, I needed to make something. And I think part of that need was the fact that I just couldn't have another project die. And so I wanted to make a proof of concept short film. And calling Bo Dixon with that proposal was very much like calling his character in the film. Because Bo is a total sweetheart if you get to know him. But I was utterly intimidated because he's kind of a legend in the Toronto film theater scene. He's been in HBO shows. He plays like 8 instruments. He's a vocal coach, acting coach. He does everything. And further, when we start to push for the feature again, I will be Jay. I will be Jay in that film, going to producers with this film as our audition, asking them to take a chance on me. I could go on all day. The point is that this is a pattern. And as I said, I'm not religious. I don't really believe in fate or in destiny, or at least not in the kind of supernatural sense that those words connote. But we can make a recognition here. We can admit that if there is any way to see the future, it is through the extrapolation of patterns. And we see into the future a lot with reliance on very simple and dependable patterns. We see with a tremendously high degree of certainty. I mean, there's occasions where it's beyond certainty. We know what the future holds. We can make predictions about the future that are objectively guaranteed to be true. And you can start simple. Unless a nuclear war happens this evening, we know that the sun will set and rise again tomorrow. And the only reason we know this is because of a pattern. It's the same thing with why a traffic light will change. So here's a question. The pattern I've just pointed out of life imitating art in this way, with rather terrifying consistency, how reliable of a predictive tool is it? And am I doomed, as I believe that I am, to living it for the rest of my life? But first, we have to figure out what's happening here, because why is this happening? It's not coincidence. I'd suggest 2 answers. The first lies in something called the frequency illusion. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? You do. No? Okay, you might know it by another name. It's simply the idea you learn a new word, and then suddenly you see it everywhere. Now, the world isn't changing, right? You don't have to make any unjustified metaphysical claims or any conspiracies about how the world is suddenly scheming to show you this new word. The world is the same. Your mind is changing. This is an entirely psychological phenomenon based on a change in attention. But at a distance, it begins to look almost like the science of manifestation. But it's not. I mean, you don't have to be fooled. It's just openness. So this is, as I see it, a partial explanation for why this pattern of life imitating art is happening to me. But there's another reason. I make self-referential art, which is to say I make meta art. I make art about art. I tell stories about stories. I direct performances about performers about. Oh my goodness! I direct performances about performance, and I speak to audiences about audience. I have long made the argument that meta processes are perhaps the single most powerful tool we have for understanding a concept. And meta art is almost certainly the most powerful tool we have for self-discovery and self-expression. And I'll unpack that. So meta art is simply when content mirrors form. It is any system with a unity between content and form. And this was explained really well to me by my English teacher in high school, who was teaching us The Great Gatsby. And The Great Gatsby is essentially about a man who is obsessed with the past. Right? He's obsessed with Daisy, with this woman who kind of represents the epitome of perfection. And he's longed for her since he was a child. I'm going to read you the last lines of The Great Gatsby because they're just so good. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms further, and one fine morning, so we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. Isn't that good? And I don't blame you if you have no idea what that means or why it's significant. I don't either. But here's the point. In terms of content, The Great Gatsby is about an obsession with the past. And structurally, it's a nonlinear story. Right? It is punctuated by flashbacks and by long monologues of characters talking about the past. So the form of the book is also obsessed with the past. And this, to me, results in the fullest way of exploring a theme, because the book isn't just about that. It can't be. It isn't just about that theme. It is that theme. And the same is for film. So I would argue that these two things, frequency illusion and the nature of meta art, might explain why this pattern is happening. But the second that you admit that you are invariably trapped in a cycle of life imitating art, you have to reckon with the consequences. Which is to say that unless you are exclusively writing about sunshine and rainbows and daisies and all sorts of fuzzy things, living out your art is not always going to be all that pleasant. Now, I mentioned that I'm scared, and I am. Because since we finished King Street and I took some time away from it, after 3 years working on it, and it's nowhere near to being finished. It's a proof of concept. We still need to make it into a feature. But I need to allow myself some time to work on a new story. And Berlin is the place to do that. So I started working on a new project. And it's barely a fetus right now. But it's about a disgraced comedian who, after his reputation falls apart, exiles himself to a remote island to weather the storm. And the community that lives on this island is incredibly unsettling. And things happen. You have to watch it, or I have to write it. The film is about endings. It's about mob mentality, which is something I have personal experience being on the wrong side of. It's about moving. I'm moving. It's about death, and it's about death anxiety. My idol, Stephen Fry, has a very good... I just love quoting people, don't I? He has a great line about death and art. He says, "That's the genius of an artist. We die. We, the flesh, this case we have, dies and rots. And we know this. And mostly we don't particularly like to be reminded of it. Artists find it the most fascinating thing in the world." So another question has to emerge. Why would anybody, after recognizing this pattern, choose to write about anything other than happiness and love? Right? Because the themes that I've listed are not sunshine and rainbows. And if I'm right that filmmaking is, in a sense, a process of manifestation, why choose to write about trauma or death or any struggle at all? Right? At this point, to do so would seem only understandable as utter masochism. Right? It would seem that you are sealing your fate the second that you commit to a project that involves darkness. So I think we have a bit of an issue here, or at least I do. But I actually don't think it's just me, because many artists seem to share this feeling that they are that they need to keep a well full of pain. I write about this in King Street, a well full of pain for their art, right? They feel often that their greatest creative output is somehow sourced from that pain. And this might be partially true, but unfortunately this can quite easily become a very good argument for not dealing with your pain, or at least for perversely hoping that it sticks around. And this is what the poet Rainer Maria Rilke was talking about when he said roughly, "Don't take my devils away because my angels may leave me as well." People who struggle with bipolar disorder often feel this way. There's a sense in which we fear that we are risking a flattening of our emotional landscape the second that we are to successfully dispose of our darkest emotions. But this can't be right. There has to be a healthier way of approaching darkness in art. This is my contention, and about approaching the unknown and the future. And in a beautiful flourish of irony, I believe it lies in breaking the meta pattern of our own lives. But because the enemy to me is the pedestal on which we have raised the notion of the tortured artist. The idea that people who create the most moving art, the people who go to the places the rest of us dare not go, and who come back traumatized, we make these people into heroes. I mean, we celebrate these stories as if they took the hit for the rest of us. You think of Adrian Brody in The Pianist, about the unthinkable struggle of Polish Jews in the 1940s, who prepared for this role not only by learning piano and losing a ton of weight, but by giving up his apartment, selling his car, disconnecting his phones, and moving to Europe. I hope that last one isn't so bad. I love that that's in the list. He completely isolated himself and gave up all comfort in life. His girlfriend broke up with him, and he developed clinical depression. So this, the way I see it, this is almost an empathy problem. Paul Bloom, who some of you might know, he's a superstar psychology professor at UofT. He researches and writes about this. And I had the pleasure of studying with him. And he believes that empathy is a very poor guide to making most of our decisions. And that it is ultimately antithetical to a desire to create a better future. Right? Because if you're trying to support a friend, or you're trying to address a global issue, the last thing that anyone wants is for you to empathize, in the sense that you feel what they feel. No, you want compassion, you want sympathy, you want to be understood, but you don't want me taking on the emotional weight of your problems, because then we have just doubled the emotional weight of our problems. Anyway, I could go on I could list people in history who have become idolized as tortured artists, and you can probably think about a fair few films about them, and they're very interesting. But it is unnecessary, and your mental health is not to be taken so lightly. And we need to stop perpetuating this idea that an artist needs to be struggling to make art about struggling, or about anything. I think it's very dangerous. But I can relate to this. My personal journey is one from immense anger to what I hope is increasingly a place of immense love. And in high school, I was very angry in high school. Even in my first year at U of T, the first lecture I ever gave at U of T, which some of you were here for, was about what I saw as an assault on free speech and free expression when the university tried to shut down I'm Still Here. And you could not believe, unless you knew me back then, how furious I was and how furious my professors were. But I've done a lot of work to overcome that anger and to embrace love and to learn how to deal with suffering and to learn how to help others deal with their suffering. It's ultimately why my interest turned towards consciousness and secular spirituality and meditation and psychedelic-assisted therapy. I believe in helping people. And when we screened King Street in May, I spoke about psychedelics. We were raising money for psychedelic research. And I mentioned how patients who take high doses of psilocybin in clinical trials to combat depression or PTSD or anxiety, death anxiety, when they have what's called a mystical experience, their revelation is that love is the most important thing in the universe. It's quite beautiful. And as Michael Pollan says, this Hallmark card platitude suddenly becomes this profundity. And it is a profundity, but we've heard it so many times that it becomes banal. And there's an interesting line between the banal and the profound. and psychedelics definitely works on that line. Now, of course, you don't need psychedelics to have this realization. We can talk about that. But the point is, I've been wondering, for me to write about conflict, about mob mentality, about death anxiety, is this going backwards from the place that I've arrived at? Or in other words, how do we justify voluntarily plunging into the darkest corners of our emotions and experiences, especially if we are trying to move toward love? And I actually think that we already have an answer here. So consider for a second the nature of your own thoughts. I mean, consider a bad thought. Consider the last time that you felt worried that you'd done something or said something to upset someone. It's unpleasant. And yet we know that it's important to think about and reflect on parts of our life that aren't easy, especially in the case of that icky feeling of regret, where it actually comes from a place of care. But at any given time, even without my provocation, there may be thoughts that are swirling around in your head that are quite negative. For me, I used to have a terrible habit of catastrophizing, one I still struggle with occasionally. And what I found was that when these thoughts are left unarticulated in my head, they just are that way. They just are hopelessly negative. And it just is the end of the world. It is a catastrophe. What you find is, or what I find is verbalizing, or for me making films, gives you an opportunity to superimpose an attitude onto these thoughts. And it is the attitude over which you have control. And I've become really fascinated by the idea of stealing attitudes, or collaging. I do a lot of thinking about the people in my life that I admire. And a person I really admire a person I really admired at high school and who I still admire is my high school debate coach. I keep coming back to him. His name is Teal Phelps Bondaroff. And I know only one of you actually know him, and he is just the most eccentric man you will ever meet. I love him to death. And he had a way of making everything sound interesting. It was impossible not to be captivated by what he was saying. And a lot of it, I think, came down to his inflection. I mean, I'm convinced that was it. I'm convinced that inflection was a representation of his attitude, and that his attitude toward life probably changed the nature of how his life felt. I mean, it did. It inevitably did. And it certainly changed the way that people felt around him. There was a fun to him that would wash over the substance of any discussion. And at times this was odd, and I'm sure he's done work on this, because he would be talking about difficult things. You know, he works in really important and difficult areas. He works with Oceans Asia. That's a space that's all about crime that's being done overseas to sea life, to fish. He spearheaded a huge campaign for free contraception in BC. And at the heart of that issue is a tragedy. I mean, it is the tragedy that some people don't have free access to contraception. It's a serious problem, and there's nothing fun about it. I remember having a conversation with him on a debate trip about the horror of female genital mutilation. And what I don't mean to say is that he somehow talked about these things in a sort of jolly way. I mean, that clearly wasn't it. That's not at all what it was. But you could tell that he had made a decision in his life to confront these very difficult issues with curiosity and with passion, because he wants to make changes. And so he was passionate out of love rather than out of anger. And I think it changed everything. And it's a deceptively simple recognition. What I see it as a testament to is that the way that we perform has a direct impact on the way that we feel. And I don't think that this is something that people consider as much when we talk about performance. You know, we talk a lot about how performance affects the people that we're performing for. We tend to think slightly less about how performing affects the performers themselves. And my contention is that attitude is the single most important thing that we have. Attitude and attention. And not only what we pay attention to, but the attitude with which we attend to it. Because attitude is what you can impose on content. It sits above everything, even emotions. Attitude is the form of human life. So we can tie it back to Gatsby. Form in literature is structure, and the content is whatever the content is. In life, the content is your thoughts. It is your thinking. It is the themes that you decide to engage in your art, which for me is the same things that you've seen me exploring in my films. And here is where we have to realize that a break in the unity between content and theme, form and content, is actually necessary and can be used strategically. Because it is, and I think we know this, it is fundamentally unhelpful when you are working with dark or negative content in your mind to align that with a dark form, which is to say, a negative attitude. When you make a horror film, there is simply no need for the context of that production to be scary. Right? When you make a heart-wrenching, dramatic character study, there is no need for that set to feel melancholy. My argument is that one of the ways to become a little bit healthier when we approach art or our thinking is to allow ourselves to adopt a more positive and curious and open attitude specifically towards dark things. And the darkness doesn't go away. You can't pretend that these problems don't exist, and you can't undermine their gravity. But the other way to see it is to try to recognize the distance that you have at any time from these thoughts. Don't become the contents of your thoughts or of your film. Don't allow your attitude to be ruled by them. That I think is the greater lesson, and it's the one that I'm trying to learn as someone who quite helplessly identifies with my art and identifies with my thoughts. The way to look at this from this very same idea from the perspective of the philosophy of consciousness and meditation, which is what I do my research in, is that all of these things, in fact, everything, happiness and anger and the dark and difficult themes we're exploring in art and life, your perceptions, every thought you have, is all happening in the same space. So just recognize that consciousness itself is not changing. All of these changes which you are experiencing are changing within the same space. This is something Sam Harris talks about. They're merely appearing there, and the space itself stays the same. The space is you. The space is your conscious awareness. And at no point do you have to become identical to the things that emerge in this space, which leaves room for you to merely experience them. And seeing this, as many people who have studied and taught about meditation, can be unbelievably liberating. But it's a little esoteric, so we'll drop that for a second. The real question seems to be, what meta-attitude do we adopt toward our lives? And what performance do we put on? And I think it has to be curiosity. You have curiosity on one hand, and you have resistance on the other. I really do think it can only be those two things. And we can either feel things as so uncomfortable that we must become uncomfortable, or we can be curious about everything, and we can be curious about the discomfort. And as it happens, I think curiosity is the way to see the future, because it requires no emotional flattening, right? You become open to the full height and the full depth of every emotional peak and valley in your life, which allows for the full and transformative power of catharsis, the very definition of which is the process of releasing and providing relief from strong or repressed emotions and thoughts by confronting them. And it leaves you open to confronting the big questions, the difficult conversations, but you don't need to be an artist in agony or a person in agony. So I want to end with a story, and it's not my story, it's a very old story. It's actually a long joke. It's gone by many names, but the version I like is Two Boats and a Helicopter. Does anyone know this story? Oh, you guys are in for a treat. This is such a good story. Okay, so a storm breaks over a small village, and it builds quite quickly, and soon the downpour turns into a flood. So the townspeople evacuate, but a local preacher is kneeling on the church porch, and the rising waters surrounding him. And the town butcher floats down the street in a canoe and says, you better hop in, preacher. Waters are rising quickly. And the preacher says, no, I have faith in the Lord. He will save me. All right. The waters continue to rise. The preacher has climbed up to the balcony and continues praying. And a farmer floats by on another boat. Says, preacher, brah, we got to get you out of here. Hop on board. The levee's going to collapse any second. And the preacher is strong, and he says, I will remain. The Lord will see me through. And so after a while, the levee breaks, and the flood decimates the rest of the town. and only the steeple remains above the water, and the preacher's up there clinging for his life to the cross, and a helicopter emerges through the clouds. I'm not sure what century the story's in. And someone on the helicopter calls through a megaphone, "Grab the ladder, preacher, this is your last chance." And again, the preacher insists that the Lord will deliver him. And he drowns. But he's a good guy, so he gets to heaven, and after a while he gets to speak with God. And he asks, "Lord, I had unwavering faith in you. Why did you not deliver me from the flood?" And God shakes his head and says, "What do you want from me? I sent you 2 boats and a helicopter." I love this story. And it is no way a mockery of religion. It's quite the opposite. It is a simple message that you have to be looking for a sign to see it. But it may not always be the way that you expect it to appear. What I'm trying to say is meaning is where you choose to see it. I mean, meaning is an attitude. And to dismiss this claim by saying something like, "Oh, well, it's just in your head," it just makes no sense to me. Of course it's in your head. Everything's in your head. It is the only place that meaning can be. And it's also not to say that every claim that someone makes about meaning in their life should be taken seriously. I went to the Cinema Studies Institute, and people make up utter bullshit about things all the time. It is possible to make a stretch, and we know what that looks like. But meaning, very much like beauty, is in the eye of the beholder. And things will happen in your life that you will have the opportunity to take as answers to your questions. But it does depend on what questions you've been asking. And so I think that changing our thinking here begins by realizing that there's a pattern in life, that if you look for answers, you tend to find them. And this is what I hope I've convinced you of. But what's clear is that if you aren't asking questions, if you aren't asking difficult and important questions, you simply won't notice these signs when they arrive, even if they're inches from your face. We aren't going to get any certainty about the future. I have a handful of days before I leave Toronto, and in 3.5 weeks I'll be leaving to Berlin. And I have no idea what to expect. And I don't know what any of you are going through at the moment. I know a number of you are starting a new school year. Sorry if you didn't need that reminder. This is the only time in your life that you'll be starting this particular year. Right? It may feel similar to previous beginnings, but it is in fact going to be unlike anything you've ever experienced before, or anything that you will. And others of you might not be in school, but you're moving through life, your own stages of life, which are singular in a very similar way. And so I don't know how to see the future. That was false advertising. Sue me. But I know that we are all looking for answers to our questions in different ways. And whether you use film to explore those questions, or you write, or you use conversation, think about what questions you're asking. And let curiosity be the wings that carry you into the future. Thank you.
Perfect. So, we're back. I'd like for everyone to just give another round of applause for Eli. Amazing work, amazing work. I want to first dive into the mindset of a 9-year-old.
Of a 9-year-old?
Yeah, because when I was 9, I was not thinking of making plays or writing a book. So walk us through that process. Walk us through what you were envisioning at that point in your life.
Yeah, thanks for that question. We were talking about this earlier. I mean, to write a speech and to give a presentation about the future is inevitably going to be about the past. And it's also very surreal to watch, as we were talking about, to watch your past work. Like even watching Deaf Man is surreal. I made that in high school. Even watching King Street, which we made a couple months ago, feels like you're revisiting kind of a past life. So thinking about my 9-year-old self is taking me back. I can't stress enough how unremarkable my mindset felt, because it just felt like my mindset. And my parents actually maybe stand as a better example to or a better testament to this, because when I started talking about about parenting and about my life to my parents, which kind of happened more in university. And I started asking them about their perspective on me and my brother as we grow up. One of the things that they told me was that when I was a child, they would be asked by other parents, how did you make him do it? How did you make him write those books? And do you have tips for how I can make my kid write a book? And both of my parents would just say, we didn't do anything. We didn't give him anything. Like I had a tiny little notebook that I just scribbled in during recesses when I was living in Singapore and in London. And I would just fill these notebooks with stories. And it was just, there was no sense of, oh, I'm accomplishing more than most people do during their recesses or during their 9-year-old life. It was just having a story to tell.
Interesting. So it's like you're chasing curiosity, naturally.
Yeah. It's like it was just a natural extension of childhood play. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like I think I caught a few nods when I was talking about the kind of childhood game experience. You know, where you kind of just act out stories with your friends. That seems to me to be very much what starts as the origin of a process that's then extended into what is now professional creation.
Okay. And how would you explain your mindset today in contrast to how you were back then?
That's a really good question, because my mindset today is clearly much more actively aware of process. Like it's a really beautiful thing when you're creating at a young age, because you just aren't thinking about parameters. You're not thinking about, like I said, you know, before the book launch, I didn't give a single thought to audience because I wasn't writing I wasn't writing for audience. The second that you start writing about audience, everything changes. Everything changed for me. And my life from that point on has just been a struggle either to try and come back to that place of just making art for myself and for a more intimate group of people, or to find some other healthier way. And that's what this talk was kind of about, is there something I'm missing, something that I've learned recently from another corner of my life, maybe from the work I've done in meditation, that I can rope in to course correct where I am. Because living as if you were constantly being watched is just exhausting. It is totally exhausting. And I can't help but feel that, you know, you talk to people, the ideal mindset to me, and we've talked about this, is when you reach a kind of unity between being perfectly relaxed and perfectly concentrated. And that just doesn't happen if you are thinking about audience.
Absolutely. I think if you take yourself away from trying to please an audience, you find that focus. You find that ability to center yourself in the idea of, okay, this is me, this is what I'm doing.
Yeah.
So my next question would be, what is creativity to you? Because the way I see it as a creative myself, it's a process. Yeah. And the process becomes more detailed the longer you do it, the more time you put into it. So what's creativity to you?
I like the idea of a process as well. I think I can conceptualize creativity as a playground. I love the playground metaphor, again, because it takes you back to childhood and it takes you back to kind of a spontaneous process of creation. What is creativity to me? Creativity to me is problem solving. And you see that when you work in film especially. Everyone, the first thing anyone will tell you the second that you start making films is that film is all about problem solving. It's all about dealing with that really annoying like camera operator that you just have to deal with. And it's about working through conflict. This is the other thing that I began, you know, one offshoot of being a very angry child was I came to love conflict. I came to get off on it, like, because as a debater, you were given a controlled space with which to have a playground of conflict. But the second that you don't have that arena, you find it in your own life. You begin silly arguments with friends and pointless. You have pointless bickering with your partner. It is actually kind of astounding, you know, and so. Creativity and the importance of writing, not only the struggle of creativity, but writing about struggle within your creative pursuit, to me is very much the point.
So how do you find yourself creating layers upon layers within your art?
It happened by accident. I wasn't thinking. It wasn't quite intentional. Like the argument that I made about meta art being one of the greatest ways to explore a theme in its full shape was not something that I had in mind when I started doing this. It came up naturally, and I think it will probably come up naturally in everyone's life if it hasn't already, because you are only writing about things that you find important. Or you are in the midst of working your way out of that phase that you have where you were just writing to imitate the art that you like and that you grew up with, which is fine, and everyone goes through that. That's what I went through with my first 2 books. Those books weren't about me. They were just mashups of Percy Jackson and Harry Potter, right, with my name and my brother's name and my friend Jan's name as the protagonists. Mm-hmm. And then I think at a certain point, you get tired of reshaping other people's ideas, and you start having ideas of your own, and they come from your problems. And so as your problems compound, and this to me is the dilemma. It's the dilemma of the well of pain that I talked about. Because the second that you start realizing that really good and really personal and really original art comes from your problems, you feel disincentivized to work on those problems. And you can creep into that mindset where you think, really the most grateful thing, the thing I have the most gratitude for is my pain, it is my trauma. And that's fine. If you can develop, you can cultivate a positive relationship with trauma. And I've talked to people who have. And so I can only speak from my own perspective, but what I've found is that lifting up on a pedestal of your pain and how you end up pretending that is all you are, it just is unnecessary. I think we've just focused our attention in the wrong place.
I agree. But let's get into more detail about that, because as you know, my art kind of falls in that same direction. And I have to say, I found more personal inspiration in terms of my life from looking at other people's pains and seeing how they grew from that. Yeah. So talk about that.
Yeah, and you're totally right, because we've been talking, you've caught me on exactly the thing. Like, we've been talking about art as if it's only about us, and it really isn't. Each of these films, and including I'm Still Here, came from a very different place. One of them was inspired by a quote. One of them was inspired by an experience I went through in high school. And actually, the answer to your question is that I'm Still Here wasn't inspired by my experience. It was inspired by the experience of my ex at the time, who was watching me go through this kind of shredding of reputation in high school. And so at no point when I was writing I'm Still Here was I writing about me. I was actually writing from her perspective. And so that was another learning curve.
Amazing. How do you feel? Yeah. I think this would be a great time for us to open up some questions that anybody has. I did see a hand back there earlier. Nope. Let's go.
What's your favorite theme to write?
My favorite theme? It's a good question. I mean, I guess broadly, the obvious answer is audience and performance. A very specific theme that I've become interested in is the idea of people struggling with an untimely failure, which is to say, in a number of my films, I started writing about specifically, you might find this interesting actually, specifically about musicians or other kinds of performers whose tools were starting to disintegrate. Which was to say, in I'm Still Here, I write about a pianist whose hands are broken. And King Street, the opening of King Street, is about a musician who is finding that because of his age, he's just not dexterous enough to play the guitar as smoothly as he was. And it's an odd thing to write about. It's an odd theme to choose because I'm young. Like my body is nowhere near to the kind of downward trajectory that it will probably reach. So perhaps it's an anticipation of that. Perhaps it's just me working through that anticipatory fear. But I'm sure if I thought about it for a couple more seconds, I'd probably come up with a way that that also applies to my own life. But I'm not going to think about it for a couple more seconds.
That's actually very interesting. The minute you said how this recent story, the Only Bar on King Street, is about a man struggling to play his instrument the way he used to, I thought about time.
Yeah.
So you are writing about time itself as well, and how you can place yourself in other people's experiences in contrast to that.
Totally.
That's
Totally, especially because I don't like writing about people my age. That's something I discovered very young, was the second that after I wrote my first 2 books, which, like I say, were about me and my brother and my friend, I started writing about adults. Partially, I think, because of that feeling we all have about wanting to be a bit older and a bit more mature than we are and taken more seriously. But also because I was interested, I mentioned, I framed filmmaking as a profession that is based on emotional distortion, which is maybe slightly not correct. I mean, it's not so generous, and it is more than that. But there's a reason that you gravitate towards making a film about something rather than journaling about it, right? You become, and specifically when you're working in fiction, because some part of you says, I can't have this be verbatim. This story can't be told through my face or my voice. I need to literally hire actors and performers through who can become my proxy to tell a story that I don't want to tell with my face or my voice. That is an interesting impulse. And it becomes even more interesting when you realize that you are seeking out actors or performers who are very different to you. You know, Bo Dixon is 50, and I've never been a 50-year-old man. And yet the genesis for King Street was this idea of, let's take my ambitions as a young artist and everything that I want to achieve, and my fears about everything I might not achieve, and split that up between a young aspiring comedian and an old failed songwriter, and then let these 2 artists who are struggling with performance at either end of their lives, let them just crash together and see what happens.
I got an imagery of like the philosopher and the artist, because you did study philosophy as well. So Bo Dixon plays the philosopher. He's more older, he's more wiser. He's seen more of life. He understands what's happening, what could happen, and what will happen. Yeah. But the artist is the more younger, ambitious version of yourself. Yeah. So the way I interpret it is, you are prescribing people to play parts of your mind, different areas of your thought process, and to see how it looks like on screen, which I think is amazing. Yeah.
I think that's right. It's an externalization for sure.
Yeah.
Is there another question? I think I forgot the beginning of your question, but I will try to answer all of it. What you said, tell me more, because I think I agree with you, but what do you mean by the irrationality that's buried in Deaf Man? Because I think I agree with you. I want to know what you mean. Did I stump you? Ha! You didn't think I'd ask you a question. Totally. Yeah, and actually, that might be the connective tissue between all the threads of your question, right? Like, the idea of credit is really interesting to me because it is so solid. Like, it is one of the only ways that we solidify and Ben was so right to describe creativity as a process. It is a process. It is inherently fluid. It is boundless. You know, the roles of each person on a film set almost always are blurry around the edges. And I barely feel like I understand what a director does. And I've been doing this for years. And most directors who are 20 years older than me have no idea what a director does. And they definitely have no idea what a producer does. But the point being that we have a compulsion, and you rightly pointed out that I have a compulsion, to try and make sense of things that seem pretty resistant to being made sense of. And so the instinct for people to assign credit, to do the possessory credit thing that we talked about, this is an instinct to just try and clarify something that probably shouldn't be clarified. But we do this all the time, right? We need to create ways of breaking down and labeling complex information and complex processes. And so, but what's interesting to me about your question is whether this instinct that I have to find answers is fundamentally misguided, right? Because that was kind of the thesis of my speech, was that you ask questions and you find answers. You could very well ask, well, what about the answerless questions? What about the questions that are not meant to have an endpoint or a terminus? What about the questions that are supposed to be worked through and worked towards and never reached? And I actually think that that's kind of what you're figuring out when you ask those questions, if that makes sense. But I don't know. And when I was writing this talk, one of the things I was mindful about was not trying to wrap everything with too tight of a bow. Not trying to suggest that I have the answers to everything. So any of the questions that I asked, I am more than happy to just leave hanging in the air. But because to me that is even more satisfying and conclusive than if I'm to try and fumble an answer to you as if I know, right? I would much rather have every single one of you leave this talk thinking about these questions, and we go off and we try and find answers to them. And it is just the trying to find that matters. It feels like you're living a contradiction, right? Like the second, and I imagine it even feels that way as an audience member. When you look at some of those shots, like you look at the shots of the empty audience, you can't help but feel like you're looking in a kind of strange, distorted mirror. And watching it, I mean, it's a beautiful question, because watching a film about audience and a film about trying to let go of an audience with an audience is the single most confusing thing that you can do. But I can't help but think that to put yourself in a confusing situation is the only way to work your way out of it. And so even for me, writing this talk and thinking, I'm going to write really about authenticity and about performance and about letting go of performance, but I know that the second that I get up there, I will be acting for you. And all of you have seen this. All of you have just seen this. Even right now as I talk to you, I'm really trying not to think about the fact that I just crossed my legs. I'm really trying, but I just failed. I'm very bad at it, and I think most of us are. I think if I'm to take my own medicine, what I have to say is I just have to be curious about this. I have to be curious about who I become the second I start talking. And I have to be curious about what kind of answer I give to that really great question the second my mouth starts opening. Because, there are the beautiful thing about filmmaking for me is that you get two halves of a recognition of your thought process. You get the part of you get this in debate too. In debate, you have prepared debates where you have sometimes a month to prepare your case. And then you have impromptu debates where you get up right on the spot and you make an argument. And the way that you think is incredibly different in both of those situations. It's the same thing in film. When you're making a film, you have tons of time to ruminate and to shape and to edit. When you are giving a talk, you have, in this case, 5 days to write that talk. I did it again. You have 5 days to write the talk, and then and it's something you've prepared. And then you get up here, and you have no idea what you're going to be confronted with. And I am struggling right now to understand where the next word I'm saying is coming from. I'm getting really deep here, man. But that's where my mind goes. I hope it was a good answer.
Any other questions? Yep.
That's a great question. I mean, for me, I had only one line about identifying with art, but it's something I've done for a long time. And it's the same impulse, I think, that you have when you recognize that you are sourcing your creative process from your pain. You can't help but think that is where you were drawing it from. Sorry, I forgot your question.
So how do you preserve your mental state? How do you not become like?
Yeah.
You can be really like obsessed with it. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
it's bothering you.
Yeah.
You're taking it into the art form, and then you're just kind of like getting too obsessed, and you're just invoking even more trauma.
Mm-hmm.
So it can be a healing process, or it can be even more traumatizing process.
Yeah. The way for me to answer this is to point to meditation. So one thing that you learn when you meditate is that it is not, unlike the way that most of us think about meditation if you don't have that much experience with it, it is not trying to sit down and stop thinking, right? It is actually being aware of the process of thinking from the same place that you were aware of your surroundings. And for a lot of people, and for me, my deepest fear was I don't want to feel distant from my thinking. I don't want to suddenly be outside looking in. You know, I feel like every accomplishment I've ever had was because of my thinking. Why on earth would I let that go? Other than for temporary relief from stress or pain, which to me is not worth the trade-off. But what you find is that an awareness of your thinking is not thinking less, and it's not feeling less deeply. You know, when I talk about the idea of being curious about discomfort or being curious about pain, what I don't mean to say is have an out-of-body experience and just kind of watch yourself deal with the pain. Like, don't feel it. Feel it more. Feel every part of it. But realize that it is not you. And if you take this mindset and you apply it to art, then you realize that this dilemma is an illusion. You don't have to choose between identifying with your art and therefore being able to really feel your characters and really create something complex, or being at an emotionally safe distance. You can have your cake and eat it too. You know, and it is just a matter of realizing that to observe your thinking or to observe your emotional state without judgment is not to feel that with less intensity.
I kind of want to add to that.
Please do.
We had an earlier conversation just before we started, and it talks about the exact same thing. And the example was Heath Ledger, right? Batman, he got trapped in the Joker. We all know what happened, right? So I think going back to what Eli is saying, if you are able to recognize who you are in the current position as you're looking back, you kind of give yourself that anchor to always come back to. Even if you are so deep into the character, you can kind of reel yourself back. Yeah, just don't Heath Ledger. Right. Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know that I feel like I have written a character in Deaf Man that I will be working towards for the rest of my life. Because that decision that he makes at the end of that film to deafen himself, to block out audience, is clearly not a decision that I'm prepared to make right now, because I invited all of you here. And so I struggle to feel comfortable with that because I feel like a hypocrite, you know? Like here I am trying to tell you that, oh, you don't need to be recognized for your art, for it to be meaningful. You can find some kind of deep well of internal validation. And I say this to you while I'm holding a microphone and a button-down t-shirt. I'm a hypocrite. And you're taking photos of me. The only thing that gives me relief is that I don't think hypocrisy is as bad as we make it out to be. To be a hypocrite, in this sense, is simply to be living out a contradiction. And I love that. I love contradictions. Contradictions are the only thing that we really need to care about. Anything that's not a contradiction is fine. It's set. Like you don't need to worry about that. But the second that you run up against something and you think, I'm pretty sure both of these things need to be true at the same time, but one of them has to go, that to me is the most interesting thing to work through. And so me being up here for you, talking to you about audience, talking to you about trying to release it, talking to you about not needing it, while doing and needing all those things, I hope is just a way in to understanding it better.
Skylar?
Yeah. There is a third piece. It's one that I've been discovering myself recently. I think many of us get trapped in these labels that we're kind of forced to stand by. You know, you're a student, and you're a student of this thing, and you are, and you tend to, you know, the people who who are going to be most successful in this room, if you want to look at it that way, which I don't think we should, are the people who are going to become masters at creating narratives for themselves. You know, and I know actually some of you who are really, really good at this. You know exactly how to package and present your life in a way that seems understandable to another person. And most of that's through labels. Most of that is through the kind of introduction that Ben gave, right? Which is no discredit to that kind of introduction, but it's true. We cherry pick the kind of the externalities, back to Ivan's question. We cherry pick what is concrete. What I'm interested in is realizing that there is a lot more that life has to offer than anything that will ever be under the umbrella of a position. And what I mean is, even if you break your life into, I've got my profession, I'm a student, I am a friend, and I am a family member, even if you break it into kind of a fairly diverse range of categories, the one that you are probably missing is just being a wanderer. But by being a wanderer, I mean the fact that there are decisions you can make in life that have just been dismissed because they don't seem important. And the one I'd point to is when you're in transit. You know, the second that you leave this hall and we go off for pizza, come for pizza, notice how everyone is moving. Right? Look around and notice that everyone seems to have a place that they're going. And if you notice, if collectively we notice someone sitting on a bench doing nothing, ponder how odd that is, right? And so this is kind of the root of the third thing I want to explore in Berlin. Berlin is a place full of artists, full of philosophers, but it's also full of travelers. It's people who have a destination, but also have no idea why they're there, right? They're figuring it out. And the best, you know, this summer for me is, as I think many of you will know, was a summer of learning what it means to wander and to meet strangers and to be entirely out of my comfort zone and to be underneath no label whatsoever. It's why in July I took 5 days to wander the streets of Toronto with no place to sleep and no money, with the pure intention of meeting people. And why on the first day of that trip, I just threw out the window any sense of this is how I start the conversation, any script, any pre-made icebreaker. You go into every conversation the same way that you find yourself crossing your legs. It's like, oh, that happened. You know, and what you find is you literally find your feet walking towards a person far before you are ready to walk towards that person. And it is beautiful. You have to condition yourself into that mindset. It's not something that comes around very often, simply because most of us don't give ourselves that time because we're so busy jumping around those other labels. So the transitory moments are the moments where we can wander with that aimlessness that I think will give us a bit of a richer and more well-rounded life.
Back.
Yeah. That's a great question. I mean, there's two answers. One is that I think, first of all, I think you're constantly flipping between them. You have the luxury when you're making a film of having a lot of time, and you can go between spending 20 minutes writing a scene and then watching something or reading something. And so the process itself is actually kind of an amalgam of learning and producing. But I actually find that they become one, right? And it's kind of the crux of what I'm trying to say here is that when you're in a creative process and when you're in a meta creative process, your life and your art they just blur. They blur into each other. And the other way of envisioning life and art is to say learning and creating, right? Art is creating, life is learning. And so what's been interesting to me is, you know, the second that you sit down and think, what am I going to set my mind to for the next 3 years? And that's what it tends to be for me with these films. that's an important question. What kinds of questions, what kinds of characters do you want to be living with for 3 years of your life, right? But the second that you make that decision, you commit to it, you're kind of carried away by life. And it will just take you into very interesting places that are equally relevant as creative, as facets of your creative object, and as facets of your personal life, I think. Anyone have the time? 9:20?
How do you feel?
Anyone have like one banger question?
What is the meaning of life?
Damn.
And that's our time. Thank you so much for being here. I appreciate all of you, and I would love to grab pizza and dinner and pool with anyone who'd like to. You're all invited. That's where we're off to right now. Thank you for being here. Love you guys.
Thank you.